In the heart of the medieval city of Paris, a shocking event unfolded that would leave a lasting mark on history. It was the year 1380, and the Kingdom of France was in turmoil. The old king, Charles V, had just died, leaving behind a young and inexperienced successor, Charles VI, who was only 12 years old. As the news of the king's death spread, the people of Paris took to the streets, filled with a mix of grief, anger, and a deep-seated desire for change. The death of Charles V was not just the end of an era. It was the beginning of a period of chaos and rebellion that would test the limits of medieval governance and social order. The weavers of Ghent, a city in Flanders, had already shown that ordinary people could challenge the authority of their rulers. Ghent had a long history of resistance against the Count of Flanders, who had tried to suppress the city's autonomy with brutal force. The Count's attempts to quell the rebellion in Ypres and Bruges had been marked by horrific acts of violence, including burning and hanging of the rebels. But the people of Ghent, known as the Gantois, were made of sterner stuff. They had endured sieges, truces, and even treachery, but they had never given up. Despite facing blockades and near starvation, the Gantois continued their struggle, not just for their own survival, but for the right to govern themselves. The conflict in Ghent was not a simple class war. It was a complex web of rivalries and alliances that cut across social and economic lines. The weavers, who were among the more prosperous citizens, often clashed with the lower-class fullers, who were responsible for cleaning and finishing the cloth. The weavers, feeling threatened by the Count's attempts to centralize power, were just as harsh on the fullers as they were on the Count himself. This internal conflict made the struggle in Ghent even more complicated, but it also showed that the desire for autonomy was not limited to a single class. Meanwhile, in France, the people were equally restless. The late king's promise to abolish taxes had stirred a fever of hope among the common folk. For years, they had been burdened by taxes that were supposed to fund the war against the English, but the people saw little benefit from their sacrifices. When the English commander, John of Ghent, Duke of Lancaster, raided the French countryside with impunity, the anger of the French people reached a boiling point. They felt that their hard-earned money was being wasted, and their frustration turned into outright rebellion. In Paris, the government was in disarray. The late king's eldest uncle, Duke Louis of Anjou, had been named regent, but he was more interested in pursuing his own ambitions than in governing the kingdom. Anjou, along with his brothers, the Dukes of Burgundy and Berry, were more concerned with their personal interests than with the well-being of the realm. The late king had tried to prevent this by setting up a council of 12 to assist the young king, but the uncles quickly began to dismantle the council and seize power for themselves. The coronation of Charles VI, which took place in November 1380, was a grand affair, but it was marred by a scandalous scene. At the coronation, Banquet, Anjou, and Burgundy, who detested each other, got into a physical fight over the seat of honor next to the young king. The spectacle was so disgraceful that it shocked even the most hardened courtiers. The new king, despite his young age, was already showing signs of the shallow soul that would later earn him the nickname Charles the Mad. He was more interested in the trappings of chivalry, such as shining armor and elaborate ceremonies, than in the real problems facing the kingdom. As the new government struggled to assert its authority, the people of Paris grew more defiant. The summoning of the Estates General, a meeting of representatives from the clergy, nobility, and commoners, was supposed to raise funds to replace the hearth tax. But when the Chancellor, Miles de Dormans, proposed the new taxes, the people erupted in protest. A cobbler, speaking for the common folk, delivered a fiery speech denouncing the endless greed of seigneurs and their exploitation of the poor. His words struck a chord with the crowd, and soon the streets of Paris were filled with angry artisans and workers demanding an end to taxation. The government, fearing a full-scale rebellion, initially agreed to abolish the taxes, but this only led to more chaos. The people, emboldened by their victory, turned their anger on the Jews, who were seen as easy targets for their frustrations. The pogroms that followed were brutal and widespread, with Jews being robbed, attacked, and even thrown into the Seine River. The government, in a desperate attempt to regain control, tried to protect the Jews, but their efforts were largely ignored. The fall of Hugues Aubriot, the Provost of Paris, was another sign of the crumbling authority. Aubriot, a controversial figure known for his lavish lifestyle and confrontational attitude towards the clergy, was accused of heresy, sodomy, and other crimes. After a sensational trial, he was convicted and publicly humiliated, further eroding the government's credibility. In the midst of this chaos, the young king and his uncles continued to struggle for power. The Dukes of Anjou, Burgundy, and Berry were more interested in their own fiefdoms than in the unity of the kingdom. Anjou, in particular, was obsessed with his plans to conquer the kingdom of Naples, and he was willing to do whatever it took to raise the necessary funds. This included threatening the guardian of the late king's treasure, which he eventually seized. The situation in France was a microcosm of the larger problems facing medieval Europe. The old feudal system, with its rigid hierarchies and lack of accountability, was breaking down. The people, no longer content to be passive subjects, were demanding a voice in their own governance. The nobility, accustomed to ruling without challenge, were finding it increasingly difficult to maintain their authority. And the clergy, once the moral and spiritual leaders of society, were often seen as part of the problem rather than the solution. The events in Paris and Ghent were just the beginning of a long and turbulent period in French history. The young king, Charles VI, would go on to reign for over 40 years, but his reign would be marked by mental illness, political instability, and the 100 Years' War with England. The people of France would continue to struggle for their rights, and the conflict between the crown and the commoners would shape the course of European history for centuries to come. In the end, the shock of the late king's death and the subsequent chaos in Paris served as a wake-up call for the ruling class. They could no longer ignore the growing discontent of the people. The seeds of revolution had been planted, and they would eventually lead to the French Revolution in the 18th century, which would fundamentally transform the social and political landscape of Europe. But for now, in the year 1380, the people of Paris and Ghent had shown that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit of resistance and the desire for freedom could not be easily extinguished.